I need to tell you this story because I can't keep it to myself anymore. 3 years ago, I would have laughed at someone telling me what I'm about to tell you. I would have written them off as another attention seeker, another person who'd had too much whiskey by the campfire and turned a bear into Bigfoot. But I was there. I saw what I saw. And if my story stops even one person from making the same mistake I did, then maybe sharing it is worth the ridicule. My name is Pete Dalton. I'm clear as throat, 37 now, but this happened when I was 34. I'm an electrical contractor in Missoula, Montana. Been doing it for 12 years. I wire houses, troubleshoot commercial buildings, install breaker panels. It's honest work. The kind where you solve problems with logic and tools and a little sweat. My hands are calloused from stripping wire and handling conduit. I've got a wife, Sarah, and 2 kids. Emma was 7 then, and Jackson was 5. We live in a modest ranch house on the south side of town, the kind of neighborhood where people like mow their lawns and wave to each other and nobody talks about monsters. I'm sitting at my kitchen table right now, the same one where I eat breakfast with my family, where my kids do their homework. The chair under me is worn smooth from years of use, the wood warm and familiar. There's a coffee mug in my hand, heavy ceramic, the handle molded to fit my grip after 1,000 mornings. I can hear the neighborhood through the window, someone's dog barking, a car door closing, normal life continuing like it always does. The smell of sawdust clings to my work jacket hanging by the door, mixed with that sharp copper scent that electrical work leaves on everything. These are the details of an ordinary life. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand. I was ordinary, practical, the kind of guy who believed in what he could touch and measure and explain. I never believed in cryptids, or never. I thought Bigfoot was a joke for tourists, something to sell cheap t-shirts and gas stations along mountain highways. I thought people who claimed they'd seen something unexplainable were either lying for attention or misidentifying ordinary animals in poor lighting. A bear standing on its hind legs becomes a monster. A coyote's eyes reflecting a flashlight becomes something supernatural. Fear and darkness and isolation play tricks on the mind. That's what I believed. I was wrong. For 15 years, my best friend Marcus and I went on an annual elk hunting trip. Marcus Chen. I should tell you about him because he's part of this story, and because what happened changed him even more than it changed me. We met on a construction site when we were both 19, became friends over shared lunches, and discovered we both grew up hunting with our fathers. Every November since then, we'd take a long weekend and head into the mountains. 15 years without incident. We'd seen bears, mountain lions once at a distance, elk and deer and moose. We'd weathered bad weather, gotten temporarily turned around in unfamiliar terrain, dealt with all the normal challenges of backcountry hunting. Nothing we couldn't handle, nothing that couldn't be explained. That's who I was before November 2021. A skeptic, a rational man who trusted his experience and clear as throat his common sense. I'm telling you this because what I'm about to describe sounds impossible, and I need you to know that I'm not the kind of person who jumps to wild conclusions. I exhausted every rational explanation. I fought against believing what my own eyes showed me. And in the end, the evidence was undeniable. The trip started like all the others. Marcus and I left Missoula early on a Friday morning in November. My truck loaded with our gear, rifles, ammunition, cold weather clothing, food for 3 days, sleeping bags rated for below zero. We'd reserved a Forest Service cabin in the Lolo National Forest about 3 hours southwest of town, deep in the wilderness near the Bitterroot Range. We'd hunted that general area before, though never from that particular cabin. The reservation had been easy to get. I remember thinking we were lucky to snag it during hunting season. I remember thinking that the drive took us through increasingly remote country. We followed highway through the corridor of the Laka River, then turned off onto a Forest Service road that narrowed as we climbed. The last 5 miles were barely more than a logging track. 2 ruts through the forest with grass growing between them. My truck bounced over frozen mud and rocks, branches scraping the sides. The November light was already fading by 4:30, that early winter dusk that comes too soon. Snow had fallen recently, not much, maybe 3 in, enough to dust the pine and fir forest white and make everything quiet in that particular way snow creates. We reached the cabin just as the light was turning from gray to darkness. It sat in a small clearing, maybe an acre of open ground, surrounded by dense forest on all sides. The trees pressed close, Douglas fir mostly, their dark branches heavy with snow. The cabin itself was basic Forest Service construction. One room maybe 20 by 20 ft with log walls chinked with mortar, a stone chimney and two small windows with wooden shutters. A covered porch faced east. The roof was corrugated metal stree with rust but solid. Two bunks were built against opposite walls inside with thin mattresses that smelled like must and canvas. A wood stove squatted in the corner, its pipe running up through the roof. There was a rough wooden table, two chairs, some shelves and hooks on the walls for gear. No electricity, no running water. We brought our own water and kerosene lanterns. It was exactly what we expected, exactly what we dealt with a dozen times before. The crunch of snow under our boots was the loudest sound as we unloaded the truck. The cold bit had exposed skin, Clear's throat, that metallic November cold that smells like snow and pine sap. Our breath steamed in the still air. Marcus got the wood stove going while I brought in our packs and supplies. Within 30 minutes, we had the cabin warming up, the kerosene lanterns casting that golden glow that always makes me think of my grandfather's hunting camp when I was a kid. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight line. No wind, dead calm. The silence of deep forest settled around us, broken only by the occasional crack of a branch in the cold, or the whisper of snow sliding off a pine bough. We made dinner on the wood stove. Nothing fancy, just heated chili from a can and instant coffee. We spread our maps on the table and planned the next day's hunt, tracing potential routes with our fingers, discussing which drainage to try first, where we'd seen sign on previous trips to the area. Marcus was in good spirits, joking about which of us would get an elk first, teasing me about the shot I'd missed 2 years earlier. The cabin was warming up nicely. Everything felt familiar, comfortable, exactly like all the trips before. We were in our bunks by 10:00, tired from the drive and the elevation. The wood stove ticked as it cooled. The cabin smelled like wood smoke and coffee and the particular scent of old canvas and log walls. I remember lying there in my sleeping bag, comfortable despite the cold, listening to Marcus's breathing even out as he fell asleep. I remember feeling content, grateful for the tradition, for the friendship, for the escape from daily life that these trips provided. I remember thinking nothing could go wrong. The first sound came around 10:30, maybe 11:00. I've been drifting in that space between wake and sleep when I heard it. Footsteps outside circling the cabin. Clear's throat, heavy footsteps too deliberate to be random, pressing down through the snow. My first thought was elk. We'd bedded down near elk before, heard them moving around camp, but something about the pattern wasn't right. The steps were too measured, too steady. Circle after circle around the cabin, maybe 20 ft from the walls. I sat up in my bunk listening. Marcus was awake too. I could hear his breathing change, could see his shape shift in the darkness. "You hear that?" he whispered. "Yeah, probably elk. That's what I figured." But neither of us settled back down to sleep. We both lay there listening to whatever it was making its rounds. The footsteps were heavy enough that I could feel them slightly through the cabin floor when they passed close to the walls. Too heavy for deer, maybe a moose. That made more sense than elk for something that size. Moose could be territorial, could be curious about the smoke from our chimney. The circling continued for maybe 10 minutes. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps. I strained to hear anything. The sound of the animal moving away, some indication of where it had gone. Nothing. Just the absolute quiet of winter forest at night. Then came the scratching. It started on the north wall near the corner where my bunk was positioned. A slow, deliberate scraping sound like something dragging claws down the log surface. Not frantic or random. Controlled, methodical. The sound moved along the wall, traveling from the corner toward the door. "Bear," Marcus whispered. But even as he said it, I heard the doubt in his voice. It was late for bears to still be active. Most should have denned up by now, and the sound was wrong for a bear anyway. Too purposeful, too focused. The scratching reached the door and stopped. I heard sniffing, loud, wet sniffing like something pressing its nose into the gap between the door and the frame, testing the air. The sound was so close, I could hear the intake and exhale of breath. Whatever was out there was inches from us, separated only by 2 in of wood. My heart was hammering now. I reached slowly for my rifle leaning against the wall by my bunk, my hand finding the cold metal of the barrel in the darkness. Across the room, I heard Marcus doing same. The sniffing continued for maybe 30 seconds, then silence again. We waited, barely breathing, listening to the nothing. Minutes passed, 5 then 10. The wood stove had burned down to coals, giving off barely any light. The darkness inside the cabin was nearly complete. The small windows showed only black. "I'm going to look," I whispered finally. "Pete, don't." But I was already moving, rifle in hand, crossing the cold floor and my socks to the nearest window. I pressed my face close to the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes to block any interior light reflection. Outside was absolute darkness and gently falling snow. I could see perhaps 10 ft into the clearing where our truck was parked. And beyond that, nothing but the black wall of forest. No movement, no shape, no eyes reflecting back at me. I stood there for a full minute, searching the darkness for any sign of what had been circling us, what had been scratching at the walls and sniffing at our door. "Nothing, see anything?" Marcus asked from his bunk. "No, it's gone, or it's out there where I can't see." "What do you think it was?" I wanted to say moose or bear to give him the rational explanation. The one that would let us both go back to sleep, but I'd heard that sniffing at the door and something about it had felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Something in my gut was saying this wasn't normal animal behavior. "I don't know," I admitted. "Probably nothing. Just wildlife checking out the cabin." "Yeah," Marcus said, "probably." Neither of us sounded convinced. We tried to settle back into sleep, but I kept my rifle close now, and every small sound, the settling of the cabin, the pop of cooling stove metal, the whisper of wind in the trees, brought me back to full alertness. Through the long hours before dawn, I dozed fitfully, always half awake, always listening. Clear as throat. I didn't know it then, but that was the last easy night we'd have in that cabin. By the next evening, everything would change. By Sunday morning, I'd be a different person. Someone clear as throat, who knew beyond any doubt that there are things in the mountains that shouldn't exist but do. Things that hunt, things that think. But that first night, I still thought I could explain it all away. That first night, I was still the man I'd always been. Practical, rational, skeptical. I lay in my bunk as the gray light of dawn finally began to show in the windows. Exhausted from broken sleep, and I told myself we'd been spooked by nothing. At first light, I'd learned just how wrong I was. I woke to the gray light of dawn pressing against the windows, my body stiff from tension and broken sleep. The cabin was cold. The wood stove had burned down to nothing during the night, and I could see my breath hanging in the air. Marcus was already awake in his bunk across the room, lying on his back and staring at the ceiling. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The silence felt brittle, like something that might shatter if we acknowledged what we'd heard in the darkness. "I'm going to take a look around," I said finally, sitting up. The bunk creaked under my weight, loud in the morning quiet. Marcus turned his head toward me. "You sure that's smart? It was probably nothing. Moose, maybe a bear that hasn't deaned up yet. I just want to see." I was already pulling on my boots, my fingers clumsy with cold and residual fear. I grabbed my rifle from where it leaned against the wall, checking the chamber automatically. "Loaded, safe on." "I'll get coffee going," Marcus said. He didn't argue further, but I saw his hand reach for his own rifle, keeping it close even inside the cabin. Clear as throat, the door stuck slightly in its frame. The wood had swollen with moisture and cold, and I had to put my shoulder into it. When it finally opened, the morning air hit me like a physical thing. That sharp metallic cold that comes just after sunrise in November, before the day has any warmth in it. The sky was overcast, a uniform gray that made the world seem drained of color. The snow on the ground was maybe 4 in deep now. More had fallen during the night. My breath steamed as I stepped onto the small porch, rifle held at a comfortable, ready position. The forest surrounding our clearing was absolutely still. No wind, no bird calls. That silence was the first thing that struck me as wrong. Even in winter, there should be some sound. Nuthatches, chickades, the distant drilling of a woodpecker. But there was nothing except the faint whisper of snow sliding off a pine branch somewhere in the distance. I scanned the tree line from the porch, looking for movement, seeing nothing but the dark vertical lines of trunks and the weighted horizontal branches of fir and pine. Our truck sat where we'd parked it, unmolested, its windshield and hood covered with a fresh layer of snow. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. Then I looked down at the snow around the cabin and my stomach dropped, tracks everywhere. I stepped off the porch slowly, my eyes following the trail that circled the entire structure. 3 complete loops, maybe 20 ft from the walls, just as I'd imagined while listening in the dark. But seeing them in daylight was different. Seeing them made it real in a way that sounds in the night stood in it. The prints were large, larger than anything I'd encountered in 15 years of hunting these mountains. I knelt beside the clearest set, my knee pressing into the cold snow, and I felt my breath catch in my chest. 14 in long, easily, maybe 15. The shape was elongated, almost like a human footprint, but wrong in proportion. The heel was too narrow, the toe area too wide, and there were claw marks extending beyond the print itself. 4 distinct marks, like something had pressed talons into the snow with each step. The depth of the tracks suggested serious weight, far more than a deer or even an elk would leave. These prints sank down 3, maybe 4 in through the fresh snow to the frozen earth beneath. I followed the trail with my eyes, my hands starting to shake despite the gloves I wore. The stride length was impossible. 6 ft, maybe more, between prints when whatever made them was moving on 2 legs, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the tracks changed. For stretches of the circle, the pattern was bipedal. Left foot, right foot, the distinctive back and forth of upright walking. Then, without transition, the pattern would shift. 4 prints in a different configuration, like something had dropped to all 4s and continued moving, then back to 2 legs again. Clear as throat. Nothing I knew did that. Nothing. I heard the cabin door open behind me. Marcus' footsteps crunched in the snow as he approached, 2 steaming cups of coffee in his hands. He stopped beside me, looked down at the tracks, and went completely still. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hiss of steam rising from the coffee cups. "Jesus Christ," he whispered finally. "What is that?" "I don't know." My voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. Marcus handed me one of the cups and I took it automatically, grateful for the warmth against my palm. I watched him crouch down where I'd been kneeling, examining the prints with the careful attention he usually reserved for construction measurements. He was methodical about it, Marcus. It was one of the things that made him good at his job. He didn't jump to conclusions. He looked at evidence and drew reasonable inferences. But there was nothing reasonable about these tracks. "Vortos plus claws," he said, his voice tight. "But the print shape is wrong for a wolf or a bear, and the stride." He stood up, walked to the next clear print in the sequence, pasted it off. 7 ft. "Pete, what the hell walks on 2 legs with a 7 ft stride?" "I don't know," I repeated. My coffee was cooling in my hands, untouched. I was following the circle of tracks with my eyes, seeing how they wound around our cabin again and again. 3 complete circuits. Whatever had made these had spent significant time out here studying us while we'd huddled inside in the dark. "That scratching we heard," Marcus said, "on the walls. You don't think I don't know what to think, but I did know. I just didn't want to say it out loud yet because saying it would make me the kind of person I'd always mocked. The kind who believed in monsters and cryptids and things that shouldn't exist. The practical part of my brain was still fighting, still trying to supply rational explanations. A bear with deformed paws, some kind of escaped exotic animal, a hoax, maybe someone trying to scare hunters away from this area, though that made no sense this deep in the wilderness. None of the explanations felt right. None of them accounted for what I was seeing. Marcus walked over to the spot on the north wall where we'd heard the scratching. I followed him, my boots crunching through the snow. The log surface showed fresh marks, 4 parallel gouges in the wood, each about 2 in apart, running vertically down from about 7 ft high to 5 ft. The scratches were deep enough to expose fresh wood beneath the weathered exterior. "Could bear claws," Marcus said, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Yeah, could be." I reached out and ran my fingers along one of the gouges. The wood was splintered rough. Whatever made these marks had pressed hard, dragging its claws with deliberate force. I thought about the sound we'd heard. That slow, controlled scraping. Not the frantic scratching of an animal trying to get at food, but something more purposeful, more intelligent. We followed the tracks to the door where we'd heard the sniffing. The snow there was disturbed, compressed in a way that suggested something large had stood in place for an extended period. More of those elongated prints overlapping each other. And at the base of the door frame, in the gap between wood and threshold, there were marks in the snow, lighter disturbed areas where something had pressed close, testing the air. "We should leave," Marcus said quietly. "Yeah." I looked back at the trail of prints, then at the dark line of forest surrounding us. "We should, but not right now. Let's give it a few hours, get warmed up, make a plan." He was looking at the tree line too, and I understood what he wasn't saying. We were both afraid that whatever made these tracks was out there watching us. That leaving right now, packing up in a panic, would trigger some predatory instinct we didn't want to test. It was purely gut feeling. Nothing rational about it, but the fear was real enough. "Couple hours," I agreed. "We'll break camp after we've had something to eat." We went back inside and I wedged one of the chairs under the door handle. Not that it would do much good against something that could leave tracks like that, but it made me feel slightly better. We kept our rifles close as we reheated coffee on the wood stove and forced down some breakfast neither of us wanted. The cabin felt different now. What had seemed like cozy shelter the night before now felt like a paper box. Thin walls that wouldn't stop anything determined to get in. "Maybe we should go now," I said, breaking a long silence. Marcus looked at me, then at the windows showing the gray daylight outside. "It's smarter to wait. Whatever that was, it was active at night. During the day, we're probably safer. We'll pack up slowly, check that the truck starts, make sure we're not rushing into a situation where we get stuck halfway down the logging road." He was right. That was the sensible approach. But sitting in the cabin waiting felt wrong too, like we were trapped between two bad choices. "I'm going to hunt for a few hours," I said finally. "And get my head straight. We can pack up mid-afternoon and be out of here before dark." Marcus stared at me. "You want to go into the woods now after that?" He gestured toward the door, toward the tracks outside. "I need to do something normal." I said, "I can't just sit here thinking about it, and we're probably safer spread out anyway. It's less likely to come at us in daylight, and if it does, we're not both trapped in this box." It was thin reasoning, and we both knew it. But I think Marcus understood. We'd been hunting together long enough that he recognized when I needed to move, needed to act rather than sit with my fear. "Stay within earshot," he said. "Anything weird? You shoot once and get back here fast. I'll do the same if something happens at the cabin." "Deal." I loaded extra rounds into my rifle magazine, pocketed more ammunition than I'd ever carried on a normal hunt, and headed out. The morning was still and cold, the forest wrapped in that muffled silence that fresh snow creates. I moved away from the cabin slowly, my boots breaking through the crust of ice that had formed overnight, each step loud in the quiet. Every 50 yards or so I stopped and listened, scanning the trees around me. Nothing moved. No squirrels, no birds, no sign of the elk we'd come here to hunt. The forest felt empty in a way that made my skin crawl. I'd hunted in remote areas before, experienced the solitude of deep wilderness, but this was different. This wasn't peaceful isolation. This was the absence that comes when prey animals have fled, when something dangerous has moved through and everything else has found somewhere else to be. I was about a quarter-mile from the cabin, moving through a section of dense timber where Douglas fir grew close together and blocked most of the light when I heard it. A sharp crack off to my left. The sound of a branch breaking under significant weight. I froze instantly, rifle coming up to my shoulder in one smooth motion, my finger resting along the trigger guard. I scanned the direction of the sound, seeing only the vertical lines of tree trunks and the gray-green shadows between them. Then I saw movement, something large and dark, moving parallel to my position about 50 yards out. Moving fast, too fast for the terrain and the snow. I caught only glimpses between the trees, my brain trying to process what my eyes were seeing. A massive shape, hunched forward, covered in matted fur that was dark gray or brown. It moved with a loping gait that was neither bear nor wolf. Its body too long, its proportions all wrong. I turned to face it fully, and for just a moment, less than a second, it was in a gap between two large firs standing upright. The sight locked my breath in my chest, 8 ft tall, maybe more, with shoulders so heavily muscled they looked deformed. Arms, not front legs, but arms that hung too long, ending in hands that were tipped with visible claws even at that distance. The body was wrong, all wrong. The torso of something that walked upright grafted onto the proportions of something that shouldn't. And the head, Jesus Christ, the head. A wolf's head, but larger than any wolf that had ever lived, with the elongated snout and visible fangs even from 50 yards away. But the eyes were too high on the head, positioned more forward-facing than any wolves, giving it a look of intelligence that made my blood run cold. It turned its head and looked directly at me. For that frozen instant, we stared at each other. I saw its eyes catch what little light filtered through the clouds. An amber glow, reflective like an animal's, but with something behind them that didn't belong in an animal's gaze. Recognition, awareness. It knew I was human. It knew I was prey. Then it dropped to all fours and vanished between the trees, moving with a speed that should have been impossible for something that size. I stood there, rifle still raised, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My breath came in short gasps, steaming in the cold air. The smell hit me a moment later, carried on the faint breeze, a thick animal stench like wet dog mixed with something rotten, something wrong, the smell of a predator. My rational mind tried desperately to supply an explanation. Bear, it was a bear, had to be a bear, seen at a bad angle, my mind filling in details that weren't there. But bears didn't stand like that. Bears didn't have heads shaped like wolves. Bears didn't move with that terrible, purposeful speed. The metallic taste of fear filled my mouth. My legs felt shaky, unreliable. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to back up slowly instead, keeping my rifle pointed toward where I'd seen it, scanning constantly for movement. Don't run. Running triggers the chase instinct in predators. Back away slowly. Show strength. Make yourself look large. All the wildlife safety rules I'd learned over the years came flooding back. But some part of me knew they were useless here. This wasn't a bear or a mountain lion. This was something else. Something that didn't follow the rules I knew. I made it back to the cabin in what felt like hours but was probably 10 minutes. I didn't run, but I moved fast, my breath coming hard, my legs weak with adrenaline crash. Marcus was outside, and the expression on his face when he saw me told me I looked as bad as I felt. What happened? He had his rifle up, scanning the forest behind me. I saw it. My voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. I saw what made those tracks. What was it? I opened my mouth, then closed it again. What could I say? How could I describe what I'd seen without sounding insane? I stood there in the snow outside our cabin, my hands trembling on my rifle, and I saw my own fear reflected in Marcus's eyes. I don't know, I finally said, but we need to get out of here now. We should have left right then. We should have thrown our gear in the truck and driven those 5 of logging road as fast as the terrain would allow, but we didn't. We went inside instead, and Marcus put on coffee, and we tried to pretend we could think our way through this rationally. The maps came out. Marcus's phone showing no signal but still holding its stored information. We spread everything on the rough wooden table while the afternoon light outside grew dimmer and the shadows in the forest grew longer. "Tell me exactly what you saw," Marcus said. His voice was steady, controlled, the voice he used on job sites when something had gone wrong and needed fixing, problem-solving mode. So I told him. I described the shape moving between the trees. The moment it stood upright, the wolf's head on that massive body, the eyes that looked back at me with too much intelligence. As I talked, I watched Marcus's face, waiting for skepticism or disbelief. But there was none. He just listened, his jaw tight, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. I noticed they were shaking slightly. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The kerosene lantern on the table hissed softly, its light seeming inadequate against the gathering darkness outside. "I heard stories," Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "About this area, the Lolo National Forest, the Bitterroot Range. I heard things, but I thought they were just stories." "What kind of stories?" He looked at me, then away, as if admitting it out loud was a line he didn't want to cross. Missing livestock first, then a few years ago, a hiker disappeared around here. They found his camp torn apart, found his boots and some clothes, but never found him. The official report said mountain lion, but he trailed off. But what? But the other hunters, the ones who know this area well, they tell different stories about things seen in the woods that don't match any known animal, about tracks that don't make sense. The Native American tribes around here, the Salish especially, they have legends about these mountains, shape-shifters, skinwalkers, things that look like wolves but aren't. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the cabin. You heard all this and didn't mention it. We've been planning this trip for months because they're just stories, Pete. Or at least IT. Hot they were, you know how hunters talk. Everyone's got a tale about the weird thing they saw that one time. I didn't believe it. I still don't want to believe it, but his eyes betrayed him. He believed it now. We both did. I thought back, searching my memory for any indication that we'd been warned away from this place. There was something, a fragment of a conversation from years ago. An older hunter at a sporting goods store in Missoula talking about the Lolo area when he'd overheard Marcus and me planning a trip. What had he said? Something about wolves in those mountains that weren't right, that were built wrong. I dismissed it as the rambling of a superstitious old-timer. Now I wished I'd listened more carefully. That's why the cabin was available, I said slowly. Why it was so cheap to rent. Why there were open dates during prime hunting season. Marcus nodded. Probably. Other hunters know something about this area. We didn't. The rustle of the maps as I folded them seemed too loud in the small space. Outside, the wind was picking up. I could hear it now moving through the pine branches with a sound like rushing water. The darkness beyond the windows was complete. Now the brief November day already giving way to the long night. We leave at first light, I said. Pack up everything tonight so we can move fast in the morning. Why not now? I looked at the windows at the darkness pressed against them, because I don't want to be on that logging road in the dark. It's 5 miles of bad terrain. And if we get stuck, if the truck breaks down, I didn't need to finish the sentence. We both understood. Out there in the darkness, unable to move. We'd be helpless. First light, Marcus agreed. But neither of us moved to start packing. We sat at the table, our rifles within reach, listening to the wind pick up outside. The cabin's thin wooden door looked inadequate now. The walls that had seemed solid the day before felt paper-thin, insufficient barriers against what we'd seen. I thought about my wife Sarah back in Missoula. My kids, Emma and Jackson, probably eating dinner about now, safe in our house with its locks and walls and ordinary dangers. I thought about how I'd dismissed every cryptid story I'd ever heard. How certain I'd been that the world was explainable and rational, and contained nothing that couldn't be identified and catalogued. I'd been wrong. And now Marcus and I were trapped in a cabin in the wilderness with something that shouldn't exist circling somewhere in the darkness outside. And all we could do was wait for morning, and pray it didn't come back. The wind howled. In the darkness beyond our lantern light, I heard a sound that might have been a branch breaking or might have been something else. Something moving, something hunting. I reached for my rifle and pulled it closer. It was going to be a long night. We decided to eat something around 8 that evening. Though neither of us had much appetite, it was something to do, a normal activity to cling to while we waited for morning. Marcus heated up canned stew on the wood stove while I checked our gear for the 3rd time, making sure everything was staged for a quick departure at first light. The cabin felt smaller with each passing hour, the walls pressing in, the single room becoming more coffin than shelter. I was forcing down a spoonful of the stew when the window went dark. Not gradually, instantly. One moment the kerosene lantern's glow reflected off the glass, showing the darkness and falling snow outside. The next moment, something blocked all that light, something large enough to cover the entire window. Marcus and I both looked up at the same instant. Our eyes met across the table and I saw my own terror reflected in his face. Then we both turned slowly toward the window. The face pressed against the glass was 7 ft off the ground. I can still see it perfectly when I close my eyes. An elongated wolf's snout, dark gray fur, lips pulled back slightly to show teeth that were too large, too white in the lamplight. But the eyes, Jesus Christ, the eyes were all wrong. They were positioned forward like a human's, not on the sides like a wolf's, and they reflected the lantern light with an amber glow that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the skull. The pupils were wrong, too. Vertical slits like a cat's but dilated wide in the darkness, bottomless and ancient. It stared directly at me, not at the cabin, not at the light, but at me specifically. I felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. And I understood with absolute certainty that this thing knew exactly what I was. It knew I was human. It knew I was prey. And behind those amber eyes was an intelligence that had no business existing in an animal's head. Awareness, calculation, maybe even something like curiosity or amusement. The creature's breath fogged the glass with each exhalation. I could see the condensation forming in wet clouds. Could see the moisture running down the wind. Ow in streaks. It was breathing slowly, deliberately, each breath controlled. Not the panting of an excited predator, but the measured respiration of something that was studying us, deciding what to do with us. 5 seconds, maybe less. But it felt like hours with those eyes burning into mine. My body frozen in place, my spoonful of stew suspended halfway to my mouth. Every rational thought in my head simply stopped. I wasn't thinking about what this thing might be or how it could exist. I was simply locked in that terrible eye contact, prey recognizing predator. The most ancient transaction in nature playing out across a thin sheet of glass. Then it dropped from view. The movement was sudden, clear as throat, a fall rather than a climb down. We heard it land on all fours with a heavy thud that I felt through the cabin floor. The snow crunched under its weight. It had to weigh 400 lb, maybe more. Then came the footsteps circling. The same pattern we'd heard the night before, but closer now. Much closer, right outside the walls. Marcus moved first. He lunged for his rifle, knocking over his chair in his haste. I was moving too, my body finally responding to the adrenaline flooding my system. The spoon clattered to the table. I grabbed my rifle and worked the bolt, chambering around with shaking hands. "The door," I managed to say. My voice came out rough, barely recognizable. We both grabbed the heavy wooden table, our stew spilling across its surface, and dragged it toward the door. It scraped across the floor with a sound that seemed too loud, too revealing. We positioned it against the door, wedging it as tight as we could. It wouldn't stop anything determined to get in, but it might slow it down. Clear's throat might give us time to shoot. The circling continued around and around the cabin. Those heavy footsteps in the snow, steady and patient. The sound of something that had all the time in the world, that knew we weren't going anywhere. Every few circuits we heard other sounds. The scrape of claws on logs as it tested the walls. The snuffling breath as it examined the corners of the structure, looking for weakness. Then came the vocalizations. Low rumbling sounds that started deep in the creature's chest and rose to something between a growl and a moan. Not wolf howls. I'd heard wolves in these mountains before. Their high, lonely calls echoing across valleys. This was different. Lower, more resonant, with a tonal quality that was too complex, too much like language, like it was trying to communicate something. Or maybe just letting us know it was there, toying with us. The smell came next, seeping through the gaps around the door and window frames. That same thick animal stench I'd caught in the forest. Wet fur and musk and something rotten underneath. The smell of a predator that ate meat and didn't care what condition that meat was in when it found it. The smell filled the cabin despite the cold air making my stomach turn. "What do we do?" Marcus whispered. He was standing with his back to the opposite wall, rifle raised, pointed at the door. His face was sheet white in the lantern light, slick with sweat despite the cold. "We wait," I said. "It's just testing us. It'll move on." But I didn't believe that. Neither of us did. The circling continued for hours. I don't know exactly how long, 'cause time had become elastic, each minute stretching into eternity. We stood there with our rifles, tracking the sound of the footsteps as they moved around the cabin, our arms aching from holding the weapons ready, our legs trembling with fatigue and adrenaline crash. Around midnight the circling stopped. The silence was worse than the movement. We waited, barely breathing, listening for any indication of where it had gone. Then we heard it above us, the heavy tread of something massive moving across the roof. The metal sheeting groaned under its weight. The ceiling beams creaked. I looked up, imagining I could see the wood bowing slightly, picturing the creature up there in the darkness, perhaps lying flat on the roof, listening to us through the thin barrier. "Oh God," Marcus breathed. "Oh God, oh God." The sound of rending metal cut him off. The creature was tearing at the roof, its claws scraping and pulling at the corrugated sheets. Then came a different sound, scratching from inside the chimney. It had reached down through the opening at the top, and now I could hear its claws scraping against the interior of the stone pipe, trying to find purchase, trying to climb down. The wood stove sat in the corner, its door open, the fire burning low. In the opening I could see down the pipe about 2 ft before it angled. Something moved in that darkness. A massive clawed hand, dark-furred, reaching down, testing the space. The claws were 4 in long, curved and black, scraping against the stone with a sound that made my teeth ache. I grabbed the poker from beside the stove and jabbed upward into the pipe. I felt it hit something else. Alid heard a snarl of rage from above and the hand withdrew, but I knew it was still up there, crouched on a roof, looking for a way in. That's when it started attacking the door. The first impact came without warning, a tremendous blow. It shook the entire cabin and sent the table skidding backward 6 in despite our weight pressed against it. The door held, but I heard wood crack. The second impact came 3 seconds later, just as powerful. And this time I saw the door bow inward, the heavy planks flexing under the assault. "Help me!" I shouted at Marcus, and he ran over and we both threw our weight against the table, trying to keep it wedged against the door. The impacts continued, rhythmic and powerful, and with each one the door splintered a little more. I could see cracks appearing in the thick wood, could see the frame starting to separate from the wall. Between impacts, I heard the creature breathing on the other side. Heavy exhalations of effort, almost like laughter. It was enjoying this, playing with us. "We have to shoot it," Marcus said, his voice high and tight with panic. "We will. Next time it hits, I'll fire through the door." My hands were shaking as I adjusted my grip on the rifle, bracing it against my shoulder while still leaning against the table. The next impact came, and as the door bowed inward, I fired. The rifle's report was deafening in the small space, my ears ringing instantly. The smell of gunham smoke filled the cabin. I heard a yelp from outside, high-pitched and very much like a dog's cry of pain, and then a different smell came through the gaps in the door. Blood, but wrong somehow. Darker than normal blood should smell, with an underlying scent of corruption that made me gag. I'd hit it. I'd actually hit it. For a moment there was silence. Then came a roar that made everything else seem like whispers. A sound of pure rage that vibrated in my chest and made the windows rattle in their frames. The attacks on the door resumed with triple intensity. The creature was throwing its full weight against the barrier now, no longer testing but trying to break through with everything it had. The door was failing. Each impact drove the table back farther despite our efforts. Cracks were spreading across the heavy planks like spiderweb webs. I could see the hinges starting to pull away from the frame. "It's coming in," Marcus said. His voice was strangely calm now, the panic burned away by the certainty of what was about to happen. "Pete, it's coming in and we're going to die here." "No," I said, but I could hear the lie in my own voice. The door wouldn't hold much longer. Maybe another dozen hits, maybe less. Marcus stepped back from the table, and for a terrible moment I thought he was giving up. But he knelt beside his bunk, and when he stood up I saw his hands were pressed together, his eyes closed. He was praying. I'd known Marcus for 15 years and I'd never seen him pray before. He wasn't a religious man, at least he'd never said so. But now, in what might be our final minutes, I heard him whispering words I couldn't quite make out. His voice steady despite everything. The attacks continued. The door was coming apart, splinters flying with each impact. I could see darkness through the cracks now, could see movement on the other side. The creature's claws appeared in one of the larger gaps wrapped around the edge of the door, pulling. I fired again, aiming for where I thought its body must be. Another yelp, another wave of that dark blood smell, but it didn't retreat. If anything, it became more frenzied, tearing at the door with renewed fury. I looked around desperately for anything that might help. The wood stove, we could feed it more fuel, make it bright and hot. Some animal instinct in me said that fire was important, that it might give us an edge. I started breaking up one of the wooden chairs, feeding the pieces into the stove. Marcus saw what I was doing and grabbed the other chair, smashing it against the floor to break it apart. We fed the fire until it was roaring, until the cabin was almost too hot, despite the cold air coming through the gaps around the door. The creature's shadow moved past the window, circling again. And I thought maybe the light was deterring it, making it reconsider. But the attacks on the door continued throughout the endless night. Between assaults, we heard it on the roof again, heard it testing the windows, heard those terrible vocalizations that were too intelligent to be animal sounds. My voice went from shouting every time it hit the door, from the constant stream of useless curses and threats I hurled at it. Sweat ran down my back despite the cold soaking through my shirt. The rifle became an extension of my arms, my finger never far from the trigger, my eyes burning from staring at the door without blinking. At some point, I realized with absolute clarity that we might die here, that this thing might break through, might kill us both, and no on. Would find our bodies until spring. The logging road wouldn't be passable once the snow got deep, and we hadn't told anyone exactly which cabin we'd rented. We'd be missing persons, and eventually someone would find what was left of us, and they'd blame it on a bear or wolves or exposure. They'd never believe the truth. The attacks finally stopped around 3:00 a.m. The sudden silence was so complete that for a moment I thought I'd gone deaf. Marcus and I stood there, weapons ready, staring at the mangled door, waiting for the next assault. It didn't come. We waited and waited. The fire in the stove burned down to coals. Our legs trembled with exhaustion, but we didn't lower our rifles, didn't move from our positions. Outside, nothing stirred. The first gray light of dawn came around 5:00 a.m., seeping through the windows like a promise. In that weak light, I could see the damage to the cabin clearly for the first time. The door was destroyed, held together only by the hinges and the table we'd braced against it. Deep claw marks scored the walls. The roof above us had a visible dent where the creature's weight had bent the support beams. We'd survived the night. Somehow, impossibly, we were still alive. After 30 minutes of silence, I worked up the courage to approach the window. Every step felt like walking toward my own execution. I pressed my face close to the glass, one hand on the cold pane, the other gripping my rifle. The clearing outside was gray in the pre-dawn light. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, covering some of the tracks, but not all. And there, perhaps 40 ft from the cabin near the tree, and I saw it. In the full light of dawn, weak as it was, I saw the creature completely for the first time. It was feeding. An elk lay in the snow, its body torn open, steam rising from the exposed viscera. The creature crouched over it on all fours, its massive head buried in the carcass. As I watched, frozen at the window, it raised its head, strips of meat hanging from its jaws. The blood on its muzzle looked black in the gray light, 8 feet tall when it rose to its full height easily. The shoulders were grotsqually muscled, bunched with power that no natural animal should possess. Dark gray-brown fur covered its entire body, matted with blood and the elk's gore. The arms, and they were arms, not front legs, hung too long, ending in those huge clawed hands. The legs were digitra, bent backward like a dog's but thick as tree trunks. And the head, that massive wolf's head with 2 forward eyes and 2 intelligent gaze, turned slowly toward the cabin, toward me. We stared at each other again, 40 ft apart, with a thin pane of glass between us. I watched its breath steam in the cold air. I watched the muscles move under its fur as it rose fully upright. The elk forgotten at its feet. I saw the wound I'd given it, a dark patch on its shoulder, still seeping blood but clearly not enough to slow it down. It looked at me for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. Then deliberately it dropped to all fours and loped toward the forest with a speed that defied its size. In 3 bounds it reached the tree. In 5, it was gone. Vanished into the darkness between the pines as if it had never existed, except for the dead elk and the blood in the snow and the destroyed door behind me and the memory of those amber eyes looking at me with something too much like recognition. "It's gone," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Marcus was beside me, instantly looking out the window at the carnage in the clearing. Jesus Christ, Pete. That's what you saw yesterday. That's what we've been dealing with all night. We waited another hour, rifles ready, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. Nothing. The forest was silent, dead. No birds, no squirrels, nothing lived in the territory of that thing. "We go now," I said finally. "Right now. We throw everything in the truck and we drive." We moved like men possessed, grabbing our gear with shaking hands, not bothering to pack it properly, just throwing everything into bags and dragging them out to the truck. I kept my rifle slung across my back, my finger near the trigger guard, constantly scanning the tree line. Marcus did the same. We didn't speak except in single-word commands. "Faster, watch now." The truck sat under its layer of snow, looking like the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Marcus swept off the windshield while I threw gear into the bed. We didn't secure anything, didn't tie anything down. We just loaded and climbed in. I put the key in the ignition with a hand that was shaking so badly I almost couldn't manage it. Please, I thought, please God, let it start. We'd left it out in below freezing temperatures all night. Sometimes engines didn't like that. Like sometimes they needed coaxing, needed multiple attempts. It started on the first try. The sound of that engine turning over, catching, roaring to life. I've never been so grateful for anything in my life. I threw it into gear and we were moving, bouncing over the ruts and rocks of that logging road, going faster than we should have, not caring. The cabin disappeared behind us in seconds, swallowed by the forest and the morning mist. Those 5 miles took forever and no time at all. I barely registered the bumps and jolts, the scrape of branches against the sides of the truck, the way we fishtailed through snow and mud. Marcus gripped the handle above his door with white knuckles, his rifle held between his knees, his eyes locked on the trees, flashing past us. Neither of us spoke. What was there to say when we finally hit paved highway? When the tires found smooth asphalt and the truck stopped bouncing and the forest fell away to reveal open country and early morning sky? I felt something inside me unclench slightly. Not release, not relief, but a slight loosening of the absolute terror that had gripped me for the past 10 hours. Marcus made a sound beside me, something between a laugh and a sob. "We made it," he said. "We actually made it." I just drove faster now, eating up the miles between us and that place, putting distance between ourselves and the thing that still lived in those mountains. I kept checking the rear-view mirror, expecting to see something loping after us, something that could cover ground faster than my truck. But there was nothing behind us except empty highway and morning light. We didn't stop until we reached Missoula. Didn't speak about what had happened. Didn't compare notes or try to make sense of it. We just drove in silence. 2 men who'd seen something that shouldn't exist and somehow survived to tell about it. Except we couldn't tell anyone. Who would believe us? Who would listen to 2 hunters claiming they'd been attacked by a werewolf in the Montana wilderness? We'd be laughed at, dismissed, maybe even evaluated for mental health issues. So, we stayed silent. And the weight of that silence has been crushing me ever